Happy Halloween, friends, and welcome to Horrorcraft. I am your host, GM Danielson, and before we begin with today's video, let me introduce you to what we are about to hear. Over the years, friends, I have had the opportunity to read with some of YouTube's most popular narrators, and these narrative efforts have produced some of the scariest material I've ever had the opportunity to edit. Listen on, friends, to some of the boldest, scariest, strangest, disturbing and flat-out terrifying stories read by some of my fellow YouTube narrators. Get ready for Jason Hill, Dr. Creepen Van Pasta, Unit 522, Olivia Steele, and so many more. I play a secondary role in this video, friends, and I wonder, can you identify where my vocal talents are? I do hope you let us scare you this Halloween.
I got out of the hospital a few months ago, but I can't forget about the Stump. I never ran past the Stump. Never. Except for once. The Stump had been there for years, at the edge of where I turned around on my runs. Right at that point where I knew I would have a hard time getting back without walking. Except for that day. Last spring, around noon on a Saturday. Gentle breeze, high 70s. The sun dipping behind the clouds every few minutes. Perfect weather. Something about the daylight had always made me feel insecure. It was the night we were always supposed to be wary of. The shadows and the silence, when the bugs would stop making noises. That's when you were supposed to worry. That's when the hairs were supposed to raise. When everything felt wrong. Not during the day, though. Not when everything was supposed to be safe. That was never how I worked, though. I was always wary of the daytime growing up. I never had nightmares at night. My nightmares were during nap times, during the day, when everyone else thought that the world was safe. I grew up as a cautious type of kid. I was afraid of a lot of things. Being alone used to matter so much more. I slept in my parents' bed until I was 4 or 5, and even after that I felt uneasy sleeping alone. Most kids feel safe if they bundle up enough in their blankets, but I never felt safe. I always felt as if I were laying on an island surrounded by evil, and nothing I could do could protect me from that. Back in high school, running was easier. I could eat what I wanted and run whenever I felt like. My run times really never got affected by those things. I was a quick kid, too. I was running low 5-minute miles. One time, I even ran a 450 mile. Not really competition speeds for college, but pretty good for a kid who just enjoyed going to city runs on the weekends. I used to imagine myself as a gazelle, running from a cheetah or some other large cat. The cats win, sometimes, but the gazelle has form over power, grace over strength. When chased, the gazelle will take every step with the intent to survive, that need to live. That was the past. After all that time running 6-minute miles hurt, I became more of a 7-minute mile type, which was fine. I wasn't racing anymore, just doing it for fun. For me, running had always been a form of meditation. About a mile or so into a run, everything would loosen up, and it would become easier to stride out. The stress on the body always felt good and pushed my mind to concentrate on the moment, to decompress, to re-evaluate. On that Saturday, everything felt right. Everything was more than fine. It was the perfect day. I was approaching the Stump and I felt amazing. The best I had felt on a run in years. Years. I approached the Stump and I hurtled like a track star. I didn't feel like I scraped anything. It was a clean jump. but I still heard a scratching sound. I didn't turn back. I was just in the zone. Birds and other animals in the woods were common on my runs. I ended up running another mile into the woods. I had never been that deep in. I was probably around 5 miles from the house when I saw a bit of smoke in the distance. I knew that there were other trails in the woods, but the trail I used was the nice one, the trail that the sun could touch almost all day. It was a cottage. That's where the smoke was coming from. The random cottage's chimney out deep in the woods. Totally not fit for anything to live in, but there it was. Something about the way the house sat on its foundation made it seem to be twisted, somehow abnormal. The windows were uncharacteristically high, almost beginning at chest level. I started to run in place, considering whether or not to keep moving forward or to turn back. The curtains in the window had some sort of floral pattern. I didn't want to trespass. I never knew who the woods really belonged to out there. Suddenly, the curtain was thrown back, and the figure behind the window was looking at me, barely peeking over the base of the windowsill. The eyes were wide. I turned and I ran toward home. It seemed so far. It took me a very long time to make it back to the woods I was familiar with. I just kept running, pumping my arms and moving my legs, breathing strong inhale, strong exhale, strong inhale, strong exhale, focus, focus, equal breathing, equal breathing. That's when I saw the stump. Except it didn't look the same. Not how I was used to seeing it. Granted, I had never approached the stump from that side before, but I knew that there was something wrong. My chest tensed up a little bit more. I slowed down to give some rest to my hips. There was some sort of lump on the tree stump that I'd never seen, some type of cancer. The closer I got, the less the lump looked like a part of the tree. It looked like some kind of matted hair, clumped and moist. I had slowed down to almost a walk. I was just a few strides away from the stump when the moist lump opened its eyes. It was some type of animal, covered in dark brown fur that almost camouflaged the stump's bark. It was only after the eyes opened that I realized both of the animal's long arms were draped over my side of the stump. The head was far behind the stump. All I could see were the eyes peeking over, like the animal was hiding from me.
Hi, Alexander. Alexander the stranger, the runner, the lone ranger. Don't look surprised. You don't remember me? We used to be so close. You slept on top of the bed, and I slept below.
It said. I looked at the arms of the animal covered in hair, powerful looking. I couldn't bring myself to speak at first. I hesitated. Are you the devil?
Oh, Alex, the devil is just a story. I am very real. I'm you. I'm not you. I'm something different. Something blue. Something better.
It said. The animal started to tap the log's bark with all of its fingers. Its way of speaking seemed to trail off on certain words in a weird, distracted tone. I need to go. I want to go home, I said. I was looking at the hands of the animal, at the claws. It was tapping its fingers against the bark. I noticed my breathing wasn't rapid. I wasn't out of breath at all from the run. Instead, I was barely breathing at all, like I kept forgetting to take another breath every few seconds. I turned my head to look back at the cottage quickly to see if anything was coming from that direction. Nothing was there. I quickly turned my head back forward to keep my eyes on the creature behind the stump.
Oh, now, Alex, don't you worry about Mother. You'll never get to meet her. You'll never get to meet her, Alex. That's what I'm here for. You shouldn't have looked. Didn't you learn never to peek under the bed, Alex? Triple X, not the sex. Not the sex. You aren't going where you want to go. This isn't the trail home. The trail of tears, the trail of fears. We're going to do something else,
it said. Up until that point, the eyes had been wondering, contemplating what the next words would be. The animal seemed to enjoy the rhymes. Every rhyme would strike some sort of emotional chord with my childhood. The shows I watched, the things I would say growing up. Then, the animal's eyes locked right into mine.
The things I'm going to do to you, Alex. Oh, oh, you haven't lived until you've... The things I will do to your innards, the belly inside. I don't want to ruin the surprise, but... Oh, the things we are going to do,
it said. I heard it clack its teeth together a few times. I swallowed and reminded myself to breathe. I made myself say something. Please don't, was all that came out. I couldn't see its mouth, but I could imagine its smile. It was in the eyes. Everything about the animal was inhuman, except for the eyes. Baby blues. They could have been my eyes. The eyes squinted a little and expression mixed with intent.
Are you going to pee yourself? Are you going to piss? Little Alex pissed the bed, and slept in the shed. You can't hide from me, Alex. You can't run away. This is our moment together. Are you going to pee-pee, cry to mother? I used to lick it up. Every time I would lick it all up. I would suck the bed dry after a good soiling. What it must taste like after all these years. I've waited, Alex. I've waited to taste it from the source. Pure, unfiltered. I followed you for a very long time. Go ahead, and do it for me. Do it for me, Alex. I just want to smell it.
The animal said. I heard it lick its lips and start clicking its teeth. I could hear them like pieces of metal clacking together. And then, the animal slowly raised its head above the stump. There was no smile, just a wide mouth of teeth. Row upon row into the blackness of its throat, as if the teeth would never end once something strayed past the animal's hairy lips. No, was all I could say.
No. Oh, Alex. We know no won't go. No. I'm going to step over this stump, and you are going to let me do it. All the dreams are about to happen. Let me suck on it. Your hand, your foot, your leg, your flesh. Just Just a nibble. Just the tips.
The animal began to laugh. Seeing the teeth, hearing the laughter, the depths of the animal's almost human voice. Scratchy, like the voice was being filtered through burning coals on a fire. My bladder let out everything. The moment that happened, the animal stopped laughing and threw its head back in the air to take in the smell. I could see its nostrils expand to an unreasonable size. Maybe it was fear. Maybe that was why. Once I realized it was going to keep its head back a moment, I shot into the edge of the woods to the right. That day was my best run in so long that I had to chance it. I had to try to escape, to run from my life. Miles. I still had miles until I would make it back home. And I wasn't on any trail. I was just running through the middle of the woods, hitting the dead pine needles with my feet, needles that were never cleared by anyone. You could have buried anything in those woods. If someone disappeared out there, that would have been it. The animal realized a few seconds after I broke the tree line that I wasn't going to wait. I didn't hear it talk, but I did hear it start moving behind me. The movement was what kept me sprinting, kept me pushing myself. I heard the legs. There seemed to be so many of them, and the trees. The animal was so strong that every few breaths I was taking, I would hear a great tree get splintered or another tree fall down. It was gaining on me. Another tree fell, and I could hear the animal breathing.
Alex.
It said. I couldn't turn around. I didn't want to. If it weren't for the terrain, I would have closed my eyes, hidden deep inside myself, and hoped to wake up alive. The breathing was so close, almost right next to my ears. I didn't want to see. I didn't want to see the moment happen. I wanted to try to fight until the very end. And that's when I found another trail. Out of nowhere, it was going in the same direction as the main trail I'd always ran down. I didn't think of anything besides getting home and escaping. I opened up my stride and I did my best to breathe correctly. Pump my arms, perfect form, not slamming my feet, not arching my back too much, staying forward, letting my core be involved. It was the most important run of my life. I was the gazelle. Breathe out. I had to be. Breathe in. I needed to be perfect. Breathe out. I needed to live. Breathe in. I knew I had a chance if I could sustain the pace, maintain, and not look back. Even on the trail, I could still hear the animal crashing through the woods behind me, as if the trail wasn't wide enough for whatever size the animal must have been. I didn't want to think about how massive it was, how easily the animal was going to tear me apart, how my skin was going to feel sliding off my bones. I tried to keep my mind on the run, on the breathing, on staying consistent, pushing off with each step long strides. I could make it if I kept the form, kept the breathing, ignore the pain in my shins and my thighs, how my hamstrings were starting to pull with the strain I was putting myself under, forcing myself to open up my stride. I was past muscle failure when I ran past the stump. I wasn't sure how I was doing what I was doing, but I knew I wanted to live, knew that if I kept that in my mind, I could do it. I was so close. I saw the edge of the woods, and there was maybe a quarter of a mile before I was out. I wasn't sure how I'd never seen the trail I was on. It appeared that the trail would connect with the main trail before the end. I was there. I was going to make it. The animal kept running after me. It must have had so many legs, smashing through the bushes and tearing apart all the trees. 10 feet away from the wood line, I took a step, but my foot didn't land right. The animal had caught me by grabbing a hold of my foot. I was pulled to the ground. My head hit something while I was being flipped upside down. The animal raised me up to its face and spoke.
Alex, I love games. I told you that you couldn't run. Was that torture for you? I let you get this far.
The animal's tongue came out of its mouth. Long and grotesque, the tongue slipped down my shorts to taste the urine. It was a violating sensation. Sandpaper. If I hadn't already done so, I would have urinated myself again.
Salty,
the animal said. I was shaking. There's a certain type of anticipation that the body experiences when the mind knows everything is about to end. I could feel it in the back of my neck, a kind of tingle. Instead of forgetting to breathe, I couldn't get enough air. My lungs were a vacuum. I was upside down but raised high enough to be eye level with the animal. The creature was something old and eternal. The hair matted in odd places, patches of scales, sharp joints of a being that should have died when the planet was young. My heart ached to be so close to home, but instead be looking at true evil. The monster, the devil, to see the matted hair and the black line over the blue eyes.
Oh, Alex, sweetie, no tears. Now, do stop screaming. No one can hear you in this terrible dream,
the animal said. The smell was too complicated for human noses to understand. It was disgusting and as hot as a furnace. My skin felt tighter after each breath from the creature. And the animal was right. I was screaming. I didn't even realize it. My mind was in so many places I couldn't think of anything to do. I was trapped. Caught. Please! The only word I managed to get out.
Don't mind if I do, boy.
What happened next was so fast. I was instantly flipped right side up and watched as the animal opened its mouth wide. All those teeth seemed to be infinite. An impossibly deep throat. A part of my mind thought I was looking into hell itself. There was no fire, just the heat of it. There was only teeth. The animal's tongue slid out of its mouth and wrapped around my leg and drifted up. I tried to struggle away, but there was nowhere to go in that amount of time. I saw my leg slowly being pulled into the mouth. The end. I closed my eyes. My skin slid off the bone like the icicle on a popsicle stick. I felt the tug, the pressure, and then heard a pop and feeling of release. At first, I couldn't tell if the fire that shot up my leg was the heat from the animal's mouth or the pain. It was searing. I couldn't help but look, see what had happened. I was bleeding everywhere, so much blood drenching the animal's face. I realized why the animal's fur was all matted. It had its eyes closed, enjoying the blood spraying all over it. Half of my light was gone, disappeared in the animal's mouth. The pain was everywhere, and I was surprised that I had not immediately gone into shock. I knew that I needed to keep my head together. I needed to concentrate. Then I heard the crunching. The animal started to chew. It was eating my leg. It dropped me to the ground. It seemed to be caught up in the sensation, like it hadn't eaten in years, and maybe it hadn't. I didn't care. I needed to escape. I needed to get home. Home. I was almost in my backyard. I was 10 feet away. There was so much blood. I knew I had only a few minutes, maybe seconds. I needed to get to my backyard. I needed to crawl. I rolled over to my stomach and I moved every remaining limb as fast as I could.
No. Stop.
The animal's mouth was full. I had the notion that it didn't want to stop chewing. It paused, as if to decide whether it should just enjoy what it had or to catch me. Maybe it paused intentionally. By the time the animal made the decision to lunge at me, I had rolled the rest of the way into my backyard. I had done it. I made it back. I rolled to my back. I knew I needed to stop bleeding. Seconds mattered. I ripped off all of my clothes and tore them to tie a tourniquet. I pulled the knots tight and covered the stump that remained of my leg. My heart was still beating. I needed to hydrate. I needed to get to a doctor. I laid on my back at the edge of my backyard, having saved myself from the animal that chased me through the woods. I passed out. I woke up an instant later. Maybe it was hours, I couldn't tell with the sun. I looked over. Maybe it had all just been a dream, a nightmare, and I had dehydrated on my run. It was a relieving feeling, but after a moment the clouds in my head started to clear. It wasn't a dream. At the edge of the woods, it was there, peeking behind a tree, somehow hiding the true size of itself. The animal. It was dangling a shredded running shoe in one of its hands. My running shoe. I heard a slow crunching sound, a steady chewing. The animal was still chewing on my bones. It began to speak again, except its voice had changed to the voice of my mother.
Alex, wake up, sweetheart. It's time to go outside and play. Go off and play in the woods. Don't you want to come back, honey? Do come back. Maybe tomorrow? Yes. Get your 5 miles in. Get your 10 miles in. I'll see you then, dear. I will see you then.
I never could figure out what made the animal stop, how it wasn't able to move past the wood line, or even how I knew I would be safe if I made it to my backyard. Was it really under my bed as a child? The cottage. Mother. I didn't understand. I crawled back to my house. The bleeding had slowed, but the bandages were soaked through with my blood. I was really lightheaded. I thought I was going to pass out again when I had to push the sliding glass door open. I managed to make a phone call before passing out again. The doctors didn't know what to think. I told them it was a gator that got me. No one would have believed anything else. No one questioned me further with that information either. People rarely show up at an ER with a leg bitten off. No doctor would have the experience to really question my story anyways. I have never gone back in the woods, never even thought about it. I could never go back. Sometimes, if I wake up before the sun rises, I'll be drinking my coffee, and right when the sun hits the tree line, I'll see it. The animal, peeking out behind a tree. Never the same tree. What is left of my leg will always ache, and I'll feel the sensation of being lowered into the animal's mouth again. And the tip of my leg feels that fire. The tip of my stump. Once the twilight of morning is past, the animal will duck behind whatever it's hiding behind and disappear. It never speaks. It never does anything else but look at me. I never see the animal's teeth, but I don't ever have to.
I grew up in Keeling, Missouri. No, you wouldn't have heard of it. It was a small, rural, upper-middle-class community where everyone owned at least an acre or two. My father was a writer, and my mom wanted to keep horses, so this was the perfect one-stoplight town to settle in. I grew up there until suddenly in 1984, the government claimed eminent domain on all of Keeling, and we were bought out. My dad then moved us to sunny California. I'm a writer too, though I'm not as well known as my father is. I write informational pieces for online magazines and blogs. As you can probably guess, I'm barely getting by. So when one of my editors asked me to write an article on eminent domain for a well-known political website, I jumped at the chance. She told me I was chosen because I had first-hand experience with eminent domain, and the buyer wanted a personal piece that included photos. I packed my bags that night, excited for the project. I'd always been curious about what became of my hometown. Anyway, before he died, my dad told me he thought Keeling had been turned into an airport. First, research. I was disappointed to find out that the internet was all but mute on the old town. Citing my sources was going to be difficult. I knew Keeling had been near Poplar Bluff, Missouri, so I pulled up Google Earth and followed 67 north to the turnoff for Keeling. Odd. The entire town was blank. Blank like there was a black gaping hole where Keeling used to be, a hole in the satellite data. I slammed my laptop shut and threw the mouse against the wall. This could only mean one thing. It was private and likely secret government property now. I hemmed and hawed on it for a few days before deciding to go anyway. This particular buyer had allowed me a per diem, funds for travel, and I might as well use them. Maybe there was still a story here. 2 days later, I was driving through Poplar Bluff in a rented Ford Focus. I stopped at a gas station for some water and granola bars, deciding to check into the hotel after I got back from Keeling. I was looking forward to seeing it again. I took the exit north on 67 and drove until I realized I had missed the turnoff. I circled back, looking for anything familiar. I drove back and forth until I found it. Barely there, covered in plant life and completely unrecognizable, was a road. I'd seen this street a million times, but never unpaved, which is why I had missed it. Someone had pulled up the asphalt and the road was completely overgrown. Bizarre. I drove the 6 miles into Keeling, wishing I had rented something with bigger tires and a higher clearance. Suddenly the pavement returned, and I rolled back into the abandoned business district of Keeling. It was small. A post office, a gas station, and a bar. All the buildings were derelict and rotting. Their decay far more consistent with something left sitting there for 100 years, not 30. I drove through the eerily quiet town with the burnt-out stoplight and continued down Route 51 towards my old house. As I passed the other houses on the street, I noticed they were in the same state of advanced decay as those in town. It was unsettling. Pulling up to the house I had lived in only 30 years before to find it crumbling and consumed by time. I went through every room in my old house for the nostalgia, but found nothing of interest. We had packed well. There was nothing left but a mannequin covered by a bedsheet in my mom's old sewing room. I was glad she left that. Those things were creepy. I left my old house and continued down the road, which by now had turned back in the dirt. Just why had the government bought this place? Why spend all that money, buy up all this land, and then abandon it? My stomach fell as I started to realize there may be no story here. I was going to return to LA empty-handed. I swore audibly. I counted house after house, knowing I was reaching the end of the street. All were in varied states of decomposition. Some had even collapsed on themselves. The house at the end of the drive began coming into view. I slowed down to take it in as it filled my windshield. I never remembered this house being this big, but then again, my parents hadn't let me go this far down the street. While every other building in Keeling was disintegrating rapidly, this house stood proud and palatial, untouched by the decades. It was almost as if this place was stealing the energy, life even, of every other building in town, and maybe even more than that. A large, very clear and defined area of dead grass circled the house. 2 dead trees stood skeletized within its radius. Maybe it was toxic groundwater. The windows were all barred, except for a small circular port window on the 3rd story. If the government had claimed this town for anything, it was clearly this house. It was so different from the others, but what was so special about it? Smelling a story at last, I parked in the pristine white driveway and climbed out of my car, hauling my camera and laptop cases over my shoulder. I walked up the first 4 steps to the front door and was delighted to find it unlocked. The foyer was large and the house smelled musty. A staircase to the second floor was set right in front of me. There was a floor-to-ceiling mirror on the wall to my left and a closed door and hallway beyond it to my right. I set my stuff down and took my phone out. No signal. Fantastic. Looks like I wouldn't be calling the hotel about my late arrival. I toured the house, snapping a few pictures with my cell phone as I went. The first floor had a library, a living room, a kitchen, and a dining room. All the furniture had been left, even the dining room table was set. Everything was orderly and oddly dust-free. Was someone still cleaning this place? The second floor had 4 bedrooms and another narrow staircase that led up to the attic. I tried the attic door first, but I found it to be locked. The first room I went into was the master bedroom. It was simple yet cozy and had an adjoining bathroom. I eyed the bed with interest. A sudden idea came to me. I may not have to leave Keeling tonight after all. The next room from the master stood with door ajar. This room was bare except for 9 mannequins, all covered in musty yellow sheets like the one at my house. I snapped a quick picture and shuddered, closing the door to the room. The next door in the hallway was closed. I opened it and stumbled back in surprise. This room had a child's bed and was filled wall to wall with dolls. I circled the room, curiously picking up a few. There was those Baby Alive dolls, Cabbage Patch dolls, and tons of creepy little yellowing porcelain dolls. They all appeared to be looking at the bed. I snapped 2 pictures in this room, vowing to come back with my Canon. I closed this door too, and entered the last room on the second floor. It was a simple office that had green carpet and green wallpaper. It had a plain desk and tan typewriter, with a new white, not yellowed piece of paper loaded into it. I left this room and descended the stairs. It was time to bring out the big guns. I bent down to unsheath my cannon when a movement caught my eye to my right. I turned to look into the mirror. I had known it was there subconsciously, so what had caught my attention? I reached for my camera again, and I realized what was wrong. The mirror, more specifically my movements in it, were somehow out of sync. When I moved my arm, my reflection did so about a quarter second later. When I blinked, my eyes were still closed in the mirror when I opened them again. It was incredibly unsettling. I continued to watch my delayed reflection when I suddenly heard a noise, like the creaking of a stair. But it didn't come from the staircase on the right. It came from directly behind me, behind the basement door. Someone was coming up the stairs of the basement. So there was someone here. I eagerly gripped the basement door and tried to open it, but like the attic, it was locked. I banged on the door but only heard silence below. Ah, animals, of course. Still determined to find a story, I opened the front door to unload my car and stopped short. What the? My car, which I had definitely parked at the top of the driveway, was now parked at the bottom, almost in the street. I had parked it at the top of the driveway, hadn't I? Maybe I'd just been excited. I couldn't remember. I unloaded the car and brought my stuff up to the master bedroom. As I walked by the sewing room, I noticed the door stood open again, but I knew I had closed it. I went to peer in, and this time, there were at least 14 sheeted mannequins in it. There had been 9 last time, right? I had counted. This time there were 5 more. Something was definitely going on. Perhaps it was all in my head. Maybe the air was toxic somehow, and that's why the government pushed everyone out of Keeling. Why was I losing it? I took another photo. By the time I deposited everything in the master bedroom, I was winded. I felt so weak. I had to lay down on the bed. This was unusual for me, someone who had nothing better to do most days than go to the gym. I must have fallen asleep because the next thing I knew, I heard someone with a high, small voice
Say bye-bye.
I bolted upright and looked around in a panic. eventually noticing one of the dolls from the little girl's room sitting on the bedside table. It was small and porcelain. Since when did they make talking porcelain dolls? I rubbed my eyes and glanced around the room. In the muted light of the setting sun, I saw someone in the corner. Not someone, something. It was one of those stupid sheet-covered mannequins. I shuddered. That definitely wasn't there before. I walked over to it. Someone was fucking with me. I knew it. I started to raise the sheet to see underneath when I heard a loud bang from downstairs. I let the sheet drop and I started toward the bedroom door when I suddenly felt very sick. I dashed into the bathroom and threw up in the toilet. I wasn't going to have a lot of time here. Whatever was going on in this place, it was making me ill. I stood up from the toilet and splashed water on my face. This time, when I looked into the bathroom mirror, my reflection's movements were at least a half second behind mine. I waved my hands in front of the mirror, horrified by my reflection's slow response. I watched the blood leave my face as I gaped at my reflection in dismay. How was this even possible? Of course, it wasn't. What was going on in the house was, dare I say it, supernatural. Possibly. I mean, what scientific explanations were there? I wanted a story, and I had gotten one. I could be the first journalist to prove the existence of, what? Ghosts? Demons? Poltergeists? I guess it didn't matter. It was my payday, and I was going to need evidence. As I turned away from the mirror to find my camera, I could have sworn I saw my reflection wink at me. I grabbed the Canon off the floor and began photographing everything I saw. I went downstairs to reshoot every room, starting with the library. I started pulling books out, one by one, and quickly realized that every single book in the library was a copy of the Bible. Many different versions and many different languages. I opened a few that were in English, and found that the word God was scratched out on every page, and every one. It was getting dark, and just as I thought about seeing if the lighting worked in this house, a light flicked on in the dining room, pouring out into the hallway. What the hell? I turned on my camera to photograph the corridor when I suddenly heard heavy stomping. It was more than stomping. It was almost running. It was coming down the hallway right towards me. I dropped the camera and stood frozen with fear. Whatever it was entered the library and stomped right up in front of me. I couldn't see anything, but there was definitely something there. I could feel it blocking me from leaving. I slowly pulled my phone out of my pocket and took a picture of whatever was right in front of me. The flash momentarily blinded me, and when I recovered my vision, all the books in the library were now on the floor, as if they had been ripped from the shelves in a rage, and in only that few seconds of silence. But I felt that whatever had been standing right in front of me was now gone. I picked up the Canon and took a few more pictures with shaky hands, and then tiptoed my way out of the room. I realized I needed video, not pictures. I pulled out my cell phone again and opened it up to video, then I walked down the hallway toward the lit dining room. I passed a painting in the hallway and caught sight of my smirking reflection. As soon as I entered the dining room, I noticed something was different. A noose made of stained sheets was now tied to a beam above the table. It was swinging back and forth, as if it were weighted. Nothing else in the room was moving. Even the beam creaked as it swung, as if it too was straining from the weight of something. I filmed it for a minute, and then raised the Canon for a picture. It suddenly stopped swinging, as if someone had grabbed it in midair. I then heard giggling from upstairs. I left the dining room and walked toward the staircase. Did I really want to go up there? I didn't hear the giggling anymore, but I heard the typewriter clicking away. I happened to glance toward the large foyer mirror again to see that it was now out of sync a full second behind me. I heard the giggling again, and then something small run down the hallway and slam a bedroom door. On gut reaction alone, I threw open the door, intending to flee. My car was now 50 yards down the street. I was about to bolt for it anyway, when I heard another stair creak behind me through the basement door. This time it was closer, further up the stairs, maybe only 5 steps below the main floor. I shook my head as if to shake it clear of fear. Every journalist dreams of a chance like this, of a story like this. I had to stay long enough to get something on video. I heard the typewriter start clicking again and sprinted up the stairs, running full speed into the office. The typewriter had stopped typing by the time I got there. I ran over to see what had been written. I sat down at the desk when I reached it, suddenly feeling tired and weak again. The paper read, "Jamie Ellis is condemned. Jamie Ellis is condemned. Jamie Ellis is condemned." Over and over again, all the way down the page. I took a photo with the Canon and waited to see if it would start typing again. Just then, I heard a giggle echo down the hallway again. I rose from the chair and left the office, stepping out into the darkening hallway. The child's bedroom door was closed, but I could hear shuffling and movement from behind it. I slowly opened the door, hoping to find animals. Cats, raccoons, mice, anything. But it wasn't animals. Every doll in the room was where I had left it, only now all their heads were turned towards the door. They were all looking at me. I heard another giggle on my right and noticed movement out of the corner of my eye. I quickly slammed the door shut and fell back against the banister in terror. I couldn't do this. I slowly got up, tired and shaky. I walked by the sewing room door. It was open again, and this time there were only 3 mannequins left in the room. I didn't stop to wonder where the others had gone. I bolted down the stairs as something ran up, stomping the entire way. I had been wrong, so wrong. It was time to leave. I needed to get out. I turned the front door handle and was sickened to find it locked. I ran down the hall through the living room and into the kitchen, pulling on the back door and screaming in frustration when it wouldn't open.
Where you going?
I heard from the living room. It was the dolls. Jesus Christ, those fucking dolls. I stumbled into the living room, which was now lit by a single tall black lamp in the corner. There was a doll on the floor in the middle of the room that I had never seen before. Knowing that my fate was probably already sealed, I walked over and picked her up off the floor. Her head hung limp, as any doll's would. "What did you say to me?" I breathed. "Nothing." "What the fuck did you just say to me?" I demanded in a crazed panic. The doll slowly picked up its head and smiled, breaking the stitching on its mouth.
You're never leaving, Jamie. You're going to be just like me soon.
I screamed and threw the doll against the wall. The lamp went out, and I heard the doll run off into the darkness. I put my head between my knees, breathing hard now. This house was draining me. It was sucking the life right from me, just like the rest of the town. I was so tired. I walked out into the hallway to make my way to the foyer again, to try the door. I dropped to my knees in agonizing fear when I saw a sheeted mannequin standing in the middle of the hallway, 15 feet away. Tears poured down my face as I noticed for the first time that this mannequin had legs and feet. Another doll. It was another human-sized doll. They were all dolls. Not knowing what else to do, I got to my feet and slowly raised the shaking camera to my eye. Peering through the viewfinder, I snapped the picture, and when I lowered the camera, I screamed. It was now right in front of me, and it was mumbling something unintelligible from under the sheet. I ran for my life, down the hall, and this time, I had no reflection in the mirror. I didn't even want to think about where my reflection had gone. As I took the stairs 2 at a time, I heard whatever it was on the basement stairs take another step up. It had to have been nearly at the top. I ran into the master bedroom, not daring to look into the sewing room on the way. I fell down onto the bed and shook with tears. I had such severe muscle weakness at this point, I could barely move. How was I going to escape this place? I raised my head to look out of the window for my car. I finally saw it. In the darkness, at the end of the street, I fell back to the bed, weak and sickly, and slowly slipped into unconsciousness. When I awoke again, it was with a start. Something was weighing me down to the bed. I shot up and noticed that I had been tucked under the covers and the entire quilt was covered in little dolls. There were so many of them, all sitting on top of the covers, trapping me there, looking in my direction. But the worst was at the end of the bed. There, leaning toward me over the footboard, was a mannequin. I watched in terror as the sheet slowly slipped off the mannequin. I fell out of the bed onto the floor. I heard the dolls giggling and laughing as I crawled my way out of the room. I didn't know where else to go. With the windows barred and the doors locked, the only way out seemed to be the small port window in the attic. I dragged myself up the stairs, hoping I had enough energy to throw myself against the door to break it in. I found it unlocked. I crawled into the attic and turned toward the window, my heart plummeting into my stomach. Oh, there was a port window, sure enough, but between it and I was a sea of dolls and mannequins. They all just stood there facing each other. There were hundreds of them. I moaned in defeated anguish, and in terrifying unison, every head slowly turned toward me. I recoiled in horror and fell down the attic stairs, hitting the second floor with a hard thud. The typewriter was clicking away again, but I already knew what it was typing. I stood up in utter pain and shuffled down the stairs. There had to be another way out. I wouldn't die here. I couldn't. All I'd wanted was my big break. What had I done to deserve all this? When I got to the bottom of the staircase, I dubiously turned to face the mirror. It was a half second behind me again. I studied it, looking for some sign of weakness, something to tell me what was going on. I didn't know what else to do. Suddenly I heard a loud knocking on the basement door behind me and jumped. Oh God. Whatever it was, it had reached the top of the stairs. I spun around toward the door in a panic and dropped to my knees in my weakened state. I happened to glance under my arm and saw that, unlike me, my reflection had remained standing and facing me. I spun back to the mirror, but by the time I did, it was just a half second behind me again. I leaned forward toward the mirror, watching it take a moment to follow. I even tried blinking, but by the time I opened up my eyes, its eyes were still open. My reflection suddenly sneered at me and slammed the glass with its fist from the other side. The glass cracked like a spider web, and I fell back in terror through the basement door that suddenly stood open. I felt every jolt, bump, and crack as I tumbled down the stairs, and when I finally came to rest at the bottom, I was in complete darkness. I tried to raise my head, but promptly passed out. This time when I came to, the room was well lit. I was lying on a concrete floor, on a dirty tan sheet, just like the mannequins standing around me wore. Other than them, there was nothing else in the basement except for a large portrait that hung on the wall. I got to my knees and stumbled over to it. The portrait was actually a mirror, or rather, was painted to look like a mirror of the room, and it was convincing. In the middle of the mirror stood a tall, dark-haired, solemn woman in a maroon dress. She looked almost familiar to me. Yes, it was her, Miss Harmon, a widow I used to see in town as a kid. But why was she dressed like she was in the 17th century? She had less wrinkles than I remembered as a kid, but had those same dark brown angry eyes. The portrait then blinked. I fell backwards into a mannequin, which somehow managed not to fall. It had regained its own balance somehow. I looked around the room. I turned back in horror to the painting to see the woman's face slowly curl into a smile. "Stay away from me," I screamed at her and ran for the stairs. I pushed my way through the mannequins, feeling their hands grab my shirt, trying to pull me back. I took the stairs 3 at a time, and when I reached the top, I slammed the door behind me. My reflection was standing in the middle of the mirror, unmoving, watching me. I knew I couldn't get out of the front door. There was only one way out now. I dragged myself into the library and grabbed the first chair I stumbled over. Running back, I raised the chair to throw it into the mirror. In the second pause that hung over my head, I heard feet, pitter-patters, and loud thunderous steps running up the basement stairs and down the staircase to my right. I could see them all coming out of the corner of my eye, but I dared not look. I threw the chair full force against the mirror as my reflection continued to sneer at me. It shattered, and with my last ounce of strength, I stumbled into the black abyss on the other side. I heard the dolls follow, but I ran and ran, for hours it seemed, until I finally tripped over something and fell. I listened for footsteps, but there was nothing but silence. Looking up, I saw I was in the woods next to the house. There was nothing behind me or around me. I had no idea where I had just come from. I could see the house. It sat quiet and serene in front of me, but I knew better. Standing to my feet, I ran. I kept falling, almost succumbing to the darkness, but I pulled myself back up. I kept moving down the road, desperate to find my car. When I finally saw it on the moonlit horizon, I pulled the keys from my pocket and all but fell into the driver's side door. Not wasting a moment, I started the car and peeled off down the street. I drove as fast as I could out of Keeling, twice slamming on the brakes when I thought I saw a sheet-covered mannequin in my rearview mirror. I never returned to Keeling, or Missouri for that matter, at least not physically. Even though my body escaped, I never did. I'm still there. Every time I sleep, or even close my eyes, I am back there, running from room to room. The dolls find new ways to surprise and terrify me every night. If I daydream, it's the same. I am only a hollow shell of who I was. My memories and my body is here, but my mind, my soul, is still in Keeling, trapped in that house. In case you're wondering, I escaped with my cannon around my neck, but all the pictures were empty, as black as the hole that was Keeling on Google Earth. Sometimes, even after I wake up in the night, I see a mannequin in the corner of my room. I know I'm in California, but I'm also in Keeling, in that house at the same time. I have been condemned to it, and a part of me lives there. Every night in my dreams, the dolls try to pull me back into that basement. So far, I've resisted, but I can't hide forever. Someday, they will drag me back into the black abyss, and what awaits me there, I do not know.
It's been a bit learning how to type blind. I was never the best at typing before. The home row approach seemed lost on me, and I sort of invented my own way. I get the computer to read it to me, and if something sounds off, I change it. Anyway, that's just a bit of introduction, so if something is off, spelling, etc., sorry. Sometimes my friends or home care worker will look over things for me, but I don't want any of them reading this. It's only been half a year. The day I lost my eyes was a sunny, crisp fall day. At first I tried to tell people what happened, but it was too weird, and it changed how they interacted with me. Even I know it sounds cray. So I made up something more plausible. Everyone thinks I was attacked by a dog. A dog, I said finally. It was a dog. The seawall, Vancouver, British Columbia, Canada. Anyone that's been here knows it. A beautiful walk around the amazing Stanley Park. under the Lionsgate Bridge, around the point looking out at the huge island across the Georgia Strait. I was out taking pictures of the fall colors. They were beautiful. God. When I remember colors, sometimes it makes me so mad. And I want to cry, but I can't anymore. So I scream, usually into a pillow, sometimes not. It was magic hour. That golden sunset just lighting the autumn colors of fire everywhere I looked. There were a lot of people out. The seawall is a popular place for joggers, bikers, people walking dogs, fellow photographers, all sorts of people out just enjoying the day. I got a lot of good shots that night, I think. My friends told me they were really beautiful. It was getting dark, and I was still snapping away. There were fewer people. I could see my breath. There's no lights along the seawall. The ambient city lights makes it easy enough to see, and the stars were out. And it was a full moon to boot. I know. Full moon. You're thinking werewolf, right? Well, sorry to disappoint. But I wish it had been a werewolf. Then it maybe would have killed me. This was something much worse. Werewolves we have seen. American Werewolf in London is one of my favorites. Werewolves at least would be a known foe. This was so alien, so strange. It started with a feeling. That feeling that tells you something isn't right. That someone's watching you. That you need to leave now. There have been a lot of murders in the park over the years. A serial killer once used it as a stalking ground. Vancouver's pretty safe, if you're not a street worker or homeless. But sometimes, you get that feeling, and you know you're not safe. And I started to leave. I was pretty much in the middle of the walk though. I could go all the way around the park or cut through on the trails. Nuts to that. The woods at night with that feeling? Hell no. I took the clockwise way around, under the bridge. That's when I heard the whispering. Even with that feeling, if you hear someone in trouble, you stop and check it out. At least I did. Whispering for help. Please, help. In the woods, just in the bushes, still green, not yet covered by the fall leaves. It wasn't far. I saw someone crouched on the ground, head turned down, whispering at something, someone. The thing, how to describe it? It was like a child, but wrong. Its head was way too small. Its back was all bent and bony looking under a really big t-shirt. It crouched over someone. They weren't moving. Their eyes were gone. Bloody holes in their head. The thing whispered at the body. Help me. Help me, someone. It said in this rasping voice that made my teeth hurt. I was frozen in place. When you see something unexplainable, you think you'd run, but really you sort of want to keep looking until it makes sense, so you can see that it's not really what it appears to be, until it's not a monster eating someone's eyes. The thing looked at me. It was dark in the trees, but I could see the glisten of blood on its too small a face. its eyes were gone. Not bloody, just black holes.
Help me,
it whispered. I backed up. It stood. Its legs were too long for its body. It took frighteningly fast steps towards me. I stumbled out onto the seawall and began to run. It overtook me in seconds and leaped on my back, pulling me to the ground. It flipped me around and crouched over me. "Please, don't, please," I said, breathless. Its face was terrible to look at. Without eyes, where should I look? How could I plead for my life? "Please, don't," I said again. It whispered at me then.
"Please don't,"
it said slowly.
"Please don't,"
it said again. I struggled. Its head struck down at me with such force, it made me see stars. Then, all of a sudden, its face was pressed against mine, and I felt its hot tongue slip inside my eyelid, under my eyeball, probing. And then it sucked, and my eye was gone. It nipped its teeth together and threw its head back to swallow. My eye. My eye. I whimpered. It brought its face back down to mine again. "No!" I shouted, trying to push it away. It was impossibly strong. "Please, no!" I said as it opened that hideous mouth. I wrenched my head to the side, trying to avoid that awful mouth. It pressed into me and kept me still. This one it had to fight for. It ended up with more than just my eyeball. But hey, at least I tried. My eyes gone. My face was wet with blood. It started licking me. I started to feel weak. That hot, disgusting tongue lapping over my cheeks. Sharp, rasping licks that stung in spite my greater injury. And then I heard them. The sound of running. Someone shouted. It leapt away from me. I only heard the first 2 steps it took into the woods, and then it was gone. The people that came to my aid were mostly helpful. One called 911. One tried to put his best effort to comfort me, telling me everything would be okay. Just lay back. Help is on the way. The sound of the third person vomiting is what made it head home, just before I passed out. And I knew it was real. The hot blood on my cheeks smelled funny. I'd never smelled my own blood before. Anyway, ambulance, hospital, recovery, blah blah blah. The expected, the boring. Talking to the police was interesting. The body in the woods, it wasn't much help. They referred me to a psychologist who came to me in the hospital until I was okay to go home. It was a dog. Must have been a dog. Yes, music and the delicious smells of cooking. All these other wonderful things to experience without sight. She was really helpful, but when I knew what I'd seen, it was hard to begin the healing. And then I went home. I knew adapting to life without eyes was going to be difficult. And that was before I realized that my encounter with the thing was not limited that one terrible night. I woke up my first night back in my own bed, whispering, "Please don't." It said it was at the corner of my room. I'm not entirely sure about this part. See, no denying that I was attacked, and my eyes are gone. But this part, the part where I sometimes wake up in the night and hear it whispering, this part I don't know is real. I could be dreaming. I hope I'm dreaming. Because then when I feel that awful tongue on my cheek, I can just tell myself I'm dreaming. And in the morning, it will be all okay. But in the morning, my cheek is raw. It hurts. I can't stop thinking about the whispering. "Please don't," is all it ever says. I've leapt out of bed and tried to go after it before, but it's too quick. I always wind up back in bed, and it always comes back. "Please don't." My cheek is raw. "Please don't. Please don't."
I have nightmares where I'm trapped in a shower. The drain is plugged and the water won't stop pouring down on me. Water rises to my ankles, to my waist, and then over my head. The shower curtain turns to glass and my screams turn to gargles. A dark figure presses its face against the glass on the other side and it watches me. I plead, but it won't let me out. I swallow water and flail helplessly in my glass coffin. I wake up gagging. I know where the nightmare came from. I never have to dig deep. The incident is never far from my subconscious. Finding it is easy. Getting over it is not. It was the summer of my 12th birthday when the Hudsons moved in across the street. 3 people, one of them a really old woman. She was tiny, frail, skeletal almost. Thin white hair, faded, blue flowery dress. Her head hung from her neck and it wobbled as the man pushed her up a makeshift wheelchair ramp into the house. At the time I couldn't figure out if she was alive or dead. A few minutes later she appeared in an upstairs window, sitting in her wheelchair. She was directly facing my bedroom, and I cautiously peered out from behind my curtains. Her head was upright now and she stared at me. Just stared, without moving her head an inch. I closed my drapes. For days she sat at the window. She watched the cars putter down our suburban road and gazed at the neighborhood kids scurrying through their yards. I never saw anyone else in the room, never saw her move from that wheelchair. At night, I'd nervously peek through the cracks in my drapes. Her silhouette was still in that window, lights off, staring out into the darkness at my bedroom. I couldn't tell, but I knew she was watching me. The stories about her cropped up pretty quick amongst my friends in the neighborhood. That she was a witch, that she was just a doll, that she was actually dead. But I knew she wasn't dead. Sure, I never saw her move from that window, not once, and I never saw her head turn. But I felt her eyes move as they studied me. I could feel her watching me. All alone in my bedroom in the middle of the night with my drapes firmly shut, I'd wake up and shudder. Her eyes were on me. I just knew it. I began sleeping on the floor. The lower I was, the better. Maybe she couldn't see me if I was on the floor. I told my parents that the old woman across the street was creeping me out. I pleaded with them to talk to the Hudsons and asked them to move her to a room without a window. They laughed and told me to let her live out her twilight years in peace. She was just watching the street, they said, and that probably made her feel happy and feel younger. Are you just going to stick me in a windowless room when I'm an old lady? My mom laughed. Remind me to move in with your sister when I'm in a wheelchair. A week later, there was some commotion at the Hudsons. I watched from my bedroom window as the man ran out of the house and opened up the double doors of his van. He jogged inside and he reappeared minutes later pushing the old woman in her wheelchair down the ramp. She looked frailer than before. She couldn't have weighed more than 70 pounds. Her head was flung to the side, resting on her right shoulder. Her body jostled in the wheelchair. But her eyes never left me, watched me the whole time. The man picked her up and placed her in the car. He folded the wheelchair and stuffed it in the trunk. He quickly hopped into the driver's seat. The younger woman pounced into the passenger seat and the man put his foot to the pedal. The old woman's limp head still faced me. It bobbed up and down as the van reversed down the driveway. I studied her face. It was expressionless, emotionless. Her tongue slightly hung from the right side of her mouth, but her eyes were on mine and they stayed on me. The van accelerated down the street and it was gone. My parents heard the news that afternoon from other neighbors. The old woman's condition was getting worse and the Hudsons had taken her to some sort of home. She wouldn't be back. I went straight to my bedroom and I looked across the street. I smiled. Her window was finally empty. The Hudsons didn't come back the next day. No van. That night I looked out towards the old woman's window. There was no one there, no wheelchair, but the bedroom light was on. I remember telling my dad I thought it was strange and he just shrugged and said, "Must be some sort of timer or something." I woke up in the middle of the night and nervously peered out my bedroom window. That bedroom light was still on. It suddenly flicked off and I ducked below my window frame. I slowly rose and looked out, expecting to see the silhouette of that tiny skeletal being. I watched for 10 minutes, pinching and straining my eyes. The lights quickly flickered on and then off again. I slept on the floor again, clutching my pillow close. I had a late baseball practice that next evening. When I got home, my house was empty. My parents were at my little sister's softball game. I needed a shower to rinse off. About 3 minutes into my shower, I felt cold. The hot steam was escaping the bathroom somehow, which didn't make sense because I had shut the door. I wiped the shampoo from my eyes, turned my head, and I heard a strange noise that would haunt me in my nightmares for years. The metal rings of the shower curtain being dragged across the shower rod. Someone was slowly opening the curtain. The shampoo stung my eyes, and through the stinging I saw a dark figure behind the curtains. Long, pale, bony fingers gripped the curtain as it slowly opened. I instinctively backed up into the shower and the curtain opened completely. There stood the old woman. I must have only looked at her for 1, maybe 2 seconds, but at that moment time stood still. All these years later, I can still draw you a vivid picture of the horrifying image in front of me. Disheveled white hair, crazy in her eyes, bones jutting out from under her stretched skin, stark naked. Blotchy skin, warts all over her body, skinny breasts hanging to her waist, hair where I didn't know people could grow hair. She smiled grotesquely, and I felt the shower tile against my back and the hot water pound my face. In her other hand, the old woman held a letter open.
"August,"
she mumbled.
"August, August, August."
I leaped past her, knocking her tiny body to the floor. I ran downstairs, naked and sopping wet. In my panic, I somehow remembered I was nude and I yanked a pair of shorts out from the hamper in the laundry room, sending the hamper crashing to the floor. I hightailed it on foot down the street, eventually winding up at my friend's house. When the police arrived, they found the old woman crumpled to a heap in the bathroom. The shower was still running. The policemen were all really nice to me, admiring me for my bravery. I told them what she said to me, August, and asked if they knew what she could have meant. "It will be August in a few days," one of them shrugged. "And you never really fully understand old and crazy, son." The Hudsons only came to our street once more to retrieve their stuff. The for sale sign was up in days. My mom told me they couldn't face the neighbors for what happened. Apparently, they had taken the old woman, the man's mother, to a special home downstate. Somehow, some way, the woman managed to escape the home and caught a bus back to our town. It never quite made sense to me. She was so old, so frail, so helpless. She could barely move those weeks she lived in that house. How had she managed to travel hundreds of miles on her own? Anyway, you can imagine what this did to me. I didn't shower for 21 years. I took baths, which I suppose aren't that different. It's still a tub and it's involving hot, soapy water. But a shower with its closed curtain, water peppering the tub floor, and steam climbing the walls. You get lost in your own head in the shower. Thoughts consume you, and it feels so utterly safe. For a few minutes you are alone from the world. It's your own private, misty kingdom. But that's what makes the shower dangerous. You're enclosed, vulnerable, naked. You're exposed. I talked to people about it, my parents, a shrink. But mainly I tried to push the incident deep down into places where I couldn't find it. I didn't talk about it with anyone since I was a kid, and life carried on. Besides the baths, I was pretty normal. A few months ago, something inside me clicked. I felt the urge to re-examine the incident, and it was almost like a voice in my head was telling me to do it. My head wanted closure. I spent hours online one night, trying to track down any information on the Hudsons and the old woman. I finally found what I was looking for, an obituary for the old woman. She had died 4 years ago. Somehow that walking skeleton hadn't checked out for another 15 years. The obituary photo was a black and white picture from when she was a young woman. It was a photo of her and her deceased husband on their wedding day. His name was August, and he looked exactly like me. I closed the browser and stared at my computer desktop for 10 minutes. It finally made more sense. Why she called me August. Why she was obsessed with watching me. Maybe she used to write letters to her husband, and that's why she was clutching the letter opener that night. For a small moment, I felt a little better. Things always felt better when they make more sense. "Honey, is everything okay?" It was my wife. "I think so," I said. I took the first shower I had taken in years that night. I didn't even jump when the curtain rungs dragged across the shower rod and my wife entered. But as she embraced me under the hot water, one question wouldn't leave my head. How come the young woman in that wedding photo looks exactly like my wife?
Just before Christmas, when I was 10 years old, we moved into a new house. Not just new to us, but new. There was still plastic on the carpeting the day we moved in, and instead of a lawn or garden in the backyard, we just had plain, soft dirt. In my mind, it was the best Christmas present ever. Having grown up in the tightly packed suburbs of Southern California, Living on a street with only 3 other houses on it was pretty awesome. One of those houses wasn't even completely built yet, and instead of across the street neighbors, there was an honest-to-God creek with rushing water and everything. The house itself was pretty cool too. My baby brother and I each got our own rooms, with locking doors even. The living room had more windows than it did plain walls, and in the bottom of my parents' closet was the little trap door that led to a crawl space beneath the house. Plus, our new next-door neighbors had a girl just a year older than me. I'd been friends with all of the kids on our old street, so I knew we were going to get along great. But the best thing about our new house was that I finally got my dad back. When my mum got accepted into grad school, my dad immediately began looking for a job in the area, but by the time it came for Mum to start school, he still hadn't found one. So, my mum took me and my 1-year-old brother with her to live in a tiny, cockroach-infested, 1-bedroom student housing apartment, while Dad stayed behind at our old house 400 miles away, while he continued to look for a new job. It took 3 months before he could join us, which to me seemed like a lifetime. Unfortunately, it didn't take long for the shine to wear off. My parents didn't have enough money to put in a lawn, and my dad kept finding raccoon holes dug up against the house in the backyard. I was forbidden from playing in the awesome creek after me and my parents found a bunch of empty beer bottles, a sleeping bag, and some drug paraphernalia on the bank one weekend. I wasn't allowed to play in the crawl space under the house since my mum saw a black widow down there. I did get to play with the girl next door some, but she was the kind of friend who spent just as much time being mean to me as actually being friendly, and she absolutely hated my friends from school. Worst of all, I hardly ever saw my dad, since his new job had him working most days from before I got up for school until just before, or sometimes even after, my bedtime. He also worked a lot of weekends. I spent a lot of time in my room reading books, mostly of the creepy thriller variety. About a year after we'd moved in, my parents decided I was old enough to stay home alone after dark, and even to babysit my brother for a couple of hours every Friday night, so they could have date night. It was around that time that things started getting weird. I started hearing noises when I was home alone. At first, it was just pots and dishes clanking together in the kitchen. The first time it happened, I was convinced there was someone in the house. This was before cell phones, and our only telephone was in the kitchen, so I locked my bedroom door and hid in my closet until my mum got home. When I told her what happened, she just laughed and told me I had an overactive imagination. She'd locked all of the doors and windows before leaving, so it had to be just dishes settling after they were stacked haphazardly. I took her word for it and tried not to let the little kitchen noises bother me, although I did wonder why the dishes only settled when I was home alone. Then came the muffin incident. My dad was working late one Saturday, so my mum made plans for all of us to meet him at a restaurant near his office for dinner, so we could at least see him for an hour or two. My mum, never the greatest when it came to punctuality, got home from our weekly grocery shopping only 5 minutes before we were supposed to meet my dad. She tossed the perishables in the refrigerator, still in their bags, and left everything else, including a plastic container of sugar-topped blueberry muffins, just sitting out on the counter, while she hustled me and my brother out of the door. A couple of hours later, we returned home, bellies full of delicious Mexican food. My dad had finished his project early and actually got to come home with us, so we were all in high spirits. While my mum took my brother off to change his diaper, Dad and I went into the kitchen to put away the groceries. Everything was exactly like we'd left it, except for one tiny detail. The muffin container was open, and the tops of each and every muffin were gone. My parents blamed our portly old cat, who was much more fond of human food than most cats. I came to a different conclusion. Clearly, we had a kitchen ghost. After that, I put any weird noises I heard in the house down to the kitchen ghost. There was a lot more clanking and clattering, and sometimes I even heard footsteps in the hallway. Just the ghost, I'd tell myself, and go back to reading. It wasn't until a few months later that I started to suspect that maybe the kitchen ghost wasn't exactly friendly. I started getting pelted with rocks when I was playing in front of my house. At first I thought it must be my friend from next door hiding in the trees, since it was exactly the kind of nasty thing she'd do. Ever since I'd mentioned the ghost to her, she'd been prank calling my house to talk in creepy voices when she knew I was home alone. But she wasn't very good at disguising her voice, so I always knew it was her. But then, one day, we were both out front playing together, and the rocks started flying at us. She gave me a frightened look and ran back to her house. That was when I realized it must have been the ghost throwing those rocks. I went to the library and read up on methods of protecting myself from ghosts and evil spirits. I made a little pouch out of fabric from my mum's craft leftovers and stuffed it with salt and sage to take with me. I drew pentagrams in salt water on the walls, door and window, and hung cinnamon sticks above the door to my bedroom. When my mum asked what I was doing, I told her about the ghost. She told me I needed to stop reading so many creepy stories. The next time I was outside, I got pelted with stones. I reached into my pocket and held the little amulet I'd created tight in my fist. I turned in the direction that the stones seemed to be coming from and stared straight into the dense trees that lined the creek.
I know you're there,
I called out to the ghost.
I know you're there, and you can't hurt me.
I stood perfectly still, waiting. Nothing happened. I walked back to my house, secure in the protection offered to me by my tiny amulet. For a few weeks, everything was quiet. There were no more footsteps, no more clattering in the kitchen. Ha! I had beaten the ghost. Or so I thought. It was a Friday night when it happened. My parents were out on their weekly date, and I was reading in the living room while my brother played with his wooden train set on the floor. Suddenly, my brother let out a wild peal of laughter, in that way that small children do when they get really excited about something. I glanced up from my book and saw that he was staring in my direction, giving me a wide baby smile. I smiled back at him and then turned my attention back to my book. A few minutes later, he started laughing again and clapping his hands together. I set down my book and crawled over to him. "What's so funny, little goose?" I asked him. My brother raised his chubby 2-year-old arm and pointed over my shoulder. "Window man," he said excitedly. My head snapped around. Just outside our living room window was the face of a man I'd never seen before. He grinned at me. I didn't even hesitate. I grabbed my brother around his middle, dashed to the kitchen to grab our cordless phone, and locked us both in my bedroom. By this time, my brother was as freaked out as I was, and it took me a few minutes to get the 911 operator to understand what I was saying over my brother's wailing and the lump in my own throat. She assured me that a police car was on its way, and they'd knock on our front door and identify themselves when they arrived. 15 minutes later, the cops arrived. They told me they were going to search around the outside of the house. They didn't find anything, Not even footprints in the soft dirt where my parents still hadn't put in a lawn. After that night, my parents didn't leave me alone at home or with my brother anymore. Due to the lack of footprints, I knew the face in the window was our ghost. But my parents were more worried that someone might have been intending to break in, even if the police didn't find any evidence of it. I was still alone most afternoons though, while my dad was at work and my mum was in class. The footsteps and other noises came back, and sometimes I heard faint whispers calling my name outside my door. The ghost hadn't gone away. He'd just gotten pissed off. I started locking the door to my bedroom whenever I was home alone. About 2 months after this incident, my parents told me that we'd be moving at the end of the school year. With Mum's tuition and textbook costs, we just couldn't afford to keep the house. I don't think I've ever been so relieved in my life. I didn't care that I'd be switching schools and moving away from all of my friends, or that we were moving back into one of those crummy student housing apartments. I was just glad to be getting out of the house. Because we were only moving about 25 minutes away, we moved our boxes in stages. My mum started taking boxes over to the apartment when she was over that way for classes, and we'd all go over on the weekends to unpack. The week before we were due to move, I got sick. I'm not talking a little sick either. I was full on unable to breathe through my nose. I was feverish and barely able to get out of bed. I went to the doctor and got antibiotics, but I was still pretty weak and muddled by the time the weekend rolled around, and wasn't up for helping my parents move things. Both my parents worried about leaving me home alone while I was so sick, but they only had the moving truck for 2 days, so they needed to get the big furniture moved immediately. I told them I'd be fine, and then curled up in a sleeping bag in my now empty bedroom to nap. I didn't know at first what had woken me up. It was dark in my bedroom except for the tiny nightlight. I wouldn't let my parents move until I did, which meant it must be night already. My parents said they'd bring me back dinner, so maybe it was them getting home. Then I heard it, a tapping on my bedroom window. At first I thought I must be imagining it, or I was hearing something else and I just thought it was at my window. I was pretty sick after all. It happened again. Definitely my window. I huddled down deeper into my sleeping bag and told myself it was nothing. Another tap. Only one this time. And then a soft voice called my name. I was fighting back tears at this point. Between my fear and being sick, I couldn't even think. I just curled myself into a ball and tried not to make any noise. All of the protections in my room had been taken down in preparation for the move, but I still had my little amulet tucked inside my nightgown. Maybe, if I pretended not to hear, the ghost would go away. It seemed like forever to my hazy mind, but eventually the tapping and calling stopped. I breathed a sigh of relief and let myself relax. I was almost asleep again when I heard the footsteps in the hallway. These weren't the faint, slow footsteps I'd heard in the past. These were heavy and quick, and they stopped just outside my bedroom door. A voice in the hallway said my name. It wasn't soft or sing-song anymore, but low and gruff. I clutched my amulet and prayed for the ghost to go away. There was a long silence, and then came a different, even more disturbing sound. Something was trying to turn my locked doorknob. It was just a soft rattle at first, and then more vigorous. I thought about trying to pull myself out of my sleeping bag, to go hide in the closet, but I couldn't take my eyes off that rattling doorknob. Then, something hit my door, hard. It sounded almost like someone was throwing their weight against it. Then it happened again. I was full on crying at this point, unable to keep quiet. I should have gone with my parents, even though I was sick. I should have gotten up and called them at the new house as soon as I heard the tapping on the window. There was another huge bang against the door, and I heard the wood start to splinter. I was sure I was about to die. And then I heard something else. The unmistakable sound of a moving van pulling into my driveway. The banging stopped, as did the rattling of my doorknob. I heard the moving van door slam, and then the fainter sound of the door to my mother's car shutting. Heavy footsteps retreated down the hallway. I waited until I heard my parents inside calling me before I got up to unlock my door. Of course, they were all sorts of worried when they saw my tear-stained face, but once I told them what had happened, they assumed I'd been having a fever nightmare. I was distraught enough, though, and they agreed we could go sleep in the new apartment that night. I didn't even want to stay long enough to eat the pizza they brought me, so insisted on eating it in the car. I never, ever went back to that house down by the creek. When I was 11 years old, I was terrified because I thought I was sharing my house with a ghost. Looking back on it as an adult, I remember that trapdoor in my parents' room that led beneath the house. I remember the raccoon holes in the backyard, and the tattered sleeping bag and drug paraphernalia we found by the creek. So, I still keep my blinds pulled at night, double-check the locks on my doors whenever I'm alone, and I try very hard not to think about what could have happened if my parents hadn't come home when they did.
I have a confession to make. I've been trying so hard to forget what I saw, but now that Halloween is right around the corner again, all these memories resurfaced all of a sudden. I now know it was wrong to keep my mouth shut. But before I tell my husband about it, and later on the authorities, I want to get it off my chest anonymously. Maybe this will help me confessing to my loved ones. My son, I'll call him Al for the sake of the story, is crazy about Halloween. Each year, he dresses up as a zombie. Al loves zombies. Last year, he begged and pleaded with me to let him go trick-or-treating with his friends. I used to always come along, but that year, he wanted to go without adult supervision. Just him and his buddies. He was 10 years old at the time and pretty mature already. I was reluctant at first, but after thinking it over for a while, I approved. We live in a friendly, rural neighborhood bordering on large cornfields. Everyone knows everyone. I figured that they would be fine. The kid needed his freedom after all. Plus, his friend Amy would come along as well. She was 12 years old already and always reminded her younger friends to behave. However, one last glimpse of uncertainty within me caused me to decide that I would sneakily follow them to keep an eye on Al from a distance without bothering him, just to be absolutely safe. I did as planned, and on Hallows' Eve, I let my son put on his costume and painted him some spooky zombie makeup, complete with sprinkles of fresh blood on his ripped clothing and smears of it around his mouth. He took a look into the mirror and let out a squeal of delight. He hugged me, grabbed his little bag, rushed outside. I waited a bit before going outside myself. His father wasn't home that night, so I left a bowl of candy on the front porch in hopes of it not being raided immediately. Upon walking out the door, I saw Al run towards a small group of other kids in fancy costumes. I recognized them all. There was Amy in her witch costume, our neighbor's son Mark was a vampire, and there was a ghost whom I could only assume was Al's best friend Blake. I smiled at the sweet sight. It was always the four of them. I followed them at a safe distance, trying not to catch their attention. I watched as they rang at the doors of several houses on their harvest, growing more and more cheerful the more candy they received. It was obvious that Amy wasn't too fond of Al's costume, though. From time to time, my son would scare her by jumping in front of her all of a sudden or making creepy sounds. Amy would shriek loudly every single time before bursting out into laughter. At some point along the way, they began developing Al's zombie scares into a full-on game of catch, my son merrily chasing around the others who, happily giggling, tried to avoid him. It was adorable to watch them play. I knew they weren't little anymore, but it still warmed my heart. They'd reached the end of the main road and were still playing catch. They were enjoying themselves, and I was content, until Amy suddenly ran off into the cornfield to the side of the road. Al, Mark, and Blake followed her, howling like little monsters along the way. I was taken aback. The cornfields were large, and children, or rather residents of our neighborhood in general, were forbidden from entering it. Not because they would trample down the corn, but because people had gotten lost in there before. I couldn't help but instantly get worried. I hurried to run after them, but seeing as I was in pretty bad shape, it took me a while to find them. When I finally caught up with them, I found that they had gathered at the side of the field. Amy was still chuckling, but completely out of breath. "Give me a second, you guys," she panted. "Aw, come on," Blake argued from under his white cloak. "Playing zombie is so much fun," Al cheered. In the heat of the game, he had completely given up on his usual calm demeanor and was losing himself in a fit of giggles. "Can we keep playing zombie? Please?" "Yeah, just give me a second, guys," Amy repeated. She was still bent over trying to catch her breath. Suddenly, the three boys stuck their heads together and began murmuring something amongst themselves, out of earshot from Amy. "What? What are you talking about?" the young girl asked. "We're playing zombie for real this time," my son exclaimed. I frowned in confusion, but stayed where I was. I watched as Blake and Mark strode towards Amy and grabbed her by the arms. "It's okay. They're just trying to scare her again," I told myself. But that notion was quickly knocked out of me when Al suddenly picked up a large stone from the dusty ground, his skinny arm struggling to lift the heavy thing. Slowly, in a pace almost menacing, he made his way over to Amy. I wanted to intervene. I wanted to dash out of my hiding spot and stop him, tear that rock out of his hands. I wanted to scream, but I couldn't. I was paralyzed. Tears began welling up in my eyes and running down my cheeks as my mouth dropped open, trying to form sounds to somehow produce the shriek I was hoping for, but to no avail. I tried to move. I tried so hard, but I just couldn't. My body didn't obey me. I watched in horror as my son lifted the rock above his head and brought it down on the screaming, struggling girl's head. He did it again, then again, then again. My son, my child, my flesh and blood bashed his friend's skull in. Blood was gushing everywhere, onto my son's hands, his face, his costume. Al let go of the stone and knelt down and fumbled around in the remains of Amy's head. I felt the vomit rise in my throat when I realized what he was doing. I remained paralyzed with fear, terror, and disgust as my son carefully picked at the bloodied, gory mess and slowly led bits of Amy's brains to his mouth. One by one, they vanished in between his lips like trick-or-treat candy. I didn't stay to watch Mark and Blake join him. When I finally regained control over my body, I simply turned and ran. I ran all the way back home, tears of shock still gushing out of my eyes. I barely made it into the bathroom before I started vomiting. When Al came home later that evening, I didn't come out to greet him. I wouldn't have dared to look into his eyes. I wouldn't have been able to. I haven't been able to look at him the same way ever since. I don't know why he did such a thing. Was it my fault? Where did I go wrong? How did my sweet little boy turn into a monster? I've pretended that everything was fine for almost a whole year now. Every time I would run into Mark's or Blake's parents on my way around town, every time I would pick up my son from school, I pretended I never saw what I saw. They found Amy's corpse the day after Halloween. The police never found out who had done it. Otherwise, I wouldn't be writing this right now. No suspects were ever arrested either. When they questioned my son, he lied through his teeth. Amy's parents moved away not long after. They couldn't stand being in that home in which they'd made so many memories with their daughter. I know I should have told the police, and I hate myself for being too weak to do the right thing. I was scared of my own son, but at the same time, scared of losing him too. I hate myself for not helping Amy. I don't know why I was unable to move, but had I been able to, if I could trade my life for hers, she would be standing here right now. I wish Halloween 2018 had never happened. It has left my son a killer, a sweet young girl dead, and me, a guilt-stricken shell of my former self. I'm not stupid. I know that withholding information from the police in a case of child murder has severe legal consequences. I deserve everything that's coming to me, but so does he. I guess I thought telling the truth wouldn't make a difference. It wouldn't bring Amy back to life. But by now, I know that those were just the cowardly, foolish thoughts of a cowardly and foolish woman. I know it's way too late, but for once, I'm going to do the right thing. I'm going to use the blood-stained costume as evidence. I never disposed of it. They're going to figure out which stains are Amy's and which are fake blood, all right. I'm going to name Mark and Blake too. No more Halloween. No more playing zombie.